of the upcoming sessions for this semester's Lunch and Learn series. We've got a really exciting lineup of some very cool and different topics that we're going to be covering over the course of the semester. Next month, we're going to have a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Brianna Pobiner, who is at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and she's going to be talking about communicating human evolution with the public. In March, we're going to have a colleague of mine by the name of Sarah Kabilka. Sarah is a former TV meteorologist and currently a science communication trainer and consultant. And she's got a really exciting talk lined up. It's called "Do I Need an Umbrella? Lessons on Communicating Scientific Uncertainty from TV Weather Forecasting." And then we'll finish off the spring series with a presentation by another colleague of mine, Bradley Alf from North Carolina State University. Bradley is an evolutionary biologist and a poet, and his session will be called "Science Sonnets, the Poetry of Good SciComm." I've pasted all of that information into the chat room, so if you scroll to the top of the chat room, you'll see the dates and the names of the speakers, as well as the link for the SciComm Lunch and Learn series website, so you can go and sign up for any of these events. Okay, so today we are starting off the spring series with a really timely and relevant session entitled "A Year of Lies, Looking Back on a Year of COVID-19 Misinformation." Our presenter today is Dr. Scott Brennan. Scott is a senior policy associate at the Center on Science and Technology Policy at Duke Science and Society. Scott is a communications scholar and specializes in dis- and misinformation, science communication, and technology policy. And I asked Scott if he could sum up a year's worth of science misinformation on the most relevant science topic of our generation in 20 minutes, which I realize is an impossible task, but I'm going to ask him to do it anyway, because as I said, I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. So with that, I would like to go ahead and invite Scott to unmute and turn on his video. And please take it away, Scott. Thank you for being here.
Great, thanks, Jory. I'm so excited to be here and to chat with you all. So give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. Is that all good? Can you hear me? Cool. So on March 8th last year, I received this email about the coronavirus from my dad. And he wrote, "I just got this from a friend. It's worth reading." The email claims to be from a friend's brother-in-law, living in China, and it says, "Tom's a retired dentist, currently dealing with cancer. I trust his medical judgment." Right, which is a side note. This itself is a pretty interesting statement about the types of expertise that matter here. But the email also provides 10 ways to treat or prevent COVID, and then describes 4 symptoms of COVID to help you identify if you have it. Now, I'd wager that some of you actually recognize this email. You see, my dad wasn't the only one to share this. It has, in fact, been spread all over the world, where it's more often described as being advice from someone's uncle, rather than a friend's brother-in-law. But it also has been debunked by a number of different fact checkers, including Snopes and the British-based outlet Full Fact. And both outlets observe that a lot of the claims here may seem reasonable, but are either a little bit off, or they include details that are not actually based in fact or on any sort of scientific evidence. So for example, it includes the very reasonable suggestion to wash your hands frequently, which is number 8. But it also includes statements like number 3. The new virus is not heat resistant and will be killed by a temperature of just 26 or 27 degrees. That's Celsius. It hates the sun. Right. So, well, we know that heat does kill the virus. Certainly 27 degrees Celsius, which is quite a bit cooler than body temperature, is not hot enough to kill the virus. So I've chosen this example not only to poke a little bit of fun at my dad, but also because this shows something about the form that misinformation often takes, in being a sort of twisting or reconfiguring of true or factual content. But it also shows something of the scale of the problem. Right? For a year now, information and discussion about COVID-19 has been everywhere, in news, on social media, in email correspondence with family members. And as news and information about the pandemic has completely saturated our lives, so has misinformation about it. So back in February, the WHO began referring to an infodemic, right? Which they said is an overabundance of information, some accurate, some not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And while we have dealt with COVID misinformation throughout the pandemic, the misinformation about COVID today looks pretty different than it did back in February, at least in terms of the sorts of claims that predominate. Now, in the next 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to try and do two things. I'm going to talk about 3 different research studies that I led that investigated different aspects of COVID misinformation over the past year. And I'm also going to try and sort of update and contextualize those findings in a little bit of other research. And my hope is, as Jory said, to offer something of a broader picture about what we know about COVID misinformation and what we still don't. Okay, so here's a bit of a roadmap for some of the topics that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to talk about the scale of the problem of misinformation, the sorts of claims that are made, the format that they often take, the role of visuals or visual content in that misinformation, the sources, where it comes from sharing it, the responses by platforms, and then the responses to the responses. And the findings that I'm going to talk about all come from, as I said, 3 projects that I actually completed in my previous position, which was leading research for the Oxford Martin Program on Misinformation Science and Media, which is a joint project between the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. And I should say I had co-authors on all these projects: Felix Simon, Rasmus Nielsen, and Phil Howard. All right, so one of the most basic things that we want to know about misinformation is simply, how much is out there. But the thing is, it's really hard to measure this, right? You need to have access to reliable data from across platforms, but also from other media, right? TV, radio, podcast, news. Some of that is really difficult to have access to. You have to be able to reliably distinguish between what is true and what is false, to recognize variations in claims. But you also have to deal with the fact that, before anything is actually seen by users, platforms are already mediating that content, choosing what to prioritize and what to exclude. So with all of that in mind, last year, in early April, we decided to look at the total number of fact checks about COVID-19 as a very, very rough and imperfect indicator of the total amount of misinformation out there. And as you can imagine, we saw this huge increase from January to March, about a 900% increase. Now, while there are very serious limitations to this data, it aligns with findings from other studies and other kind of news reporting out there. And which is to say, there's been a ton of misinformation about COVID. And I'll say, not only through March, but through the rest of the year. I think we all can sort of agree to that. All right, so we know that at a bare minimum, there's been a lot of it, but what about what that misinformation says? What about the sorts of claims that are made? So also back in April, we gathered this sample of misinformation and we coded it for the subjects of the claims that were made in it. And this is what we found. Now, there's a lot to say here, and maybe we can come back to it in questions if you want, but I really just want to focus on this first bar on the far left. And I'll say this is probably the most surprising finding of this piece, that the most common claim had to do with the actions and policies of public authorities, including governments or international organizations like the WHO or the UN. And this sort of thing, these sort of claims include things like this post on Facebook from March 14th that's not only impersonated the Florida Department of Health, but claimed that there was a lockdown when there wasn't, or this piece about the Chinese government supposedly enacting a policy of killing patients to prevent the spread of the virus. Now, the fact that so many pieces in the sample contain these sorts of claims suggests to us that in the early days of the pandemic, public authorities often did not succeed in providing clear, useful, and trusted information. In the absence of that sort of information, misinformation about these topics often kind of fills in the gaps in public discussion. But it also underscores the sort of broader crisis of trust in public institutions that has been very, very well documented, but animates in a lot of different ways, sort of a large amount of the misinformation about the actions of these public authorities. Now, after March, as the pandemic has gone on, other sorts of claims have become more prominent. Here's a study from First Draft which actually extended our analysis and used our categories through the summer. And it found that claims about community spread and impact and medical advice and issues began to sort of outpace those about public authorities, at least by the summer. And of course, right, this was when there was all this sort of increasing discussion about mask wearing, and rejection of mask wearing. More recently, of course, we are seeing, a real predominance of claims about vaccines, as you might imagine, right, as that's how public conversation is shifting, right? Like this event, which is still up on YouTube and brought together a real who's who of anti-vaxxers. Right. Again, the point, though, is that, as public discussion about the virus has evolved, so has misinformation about it. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of it, and we know very, very, briefly at least, what some of the claims look like and how they've evolved. But what does it look like in terms of the formats that it takes? Now, there are two things that I want to flag here. The first, as I already mentioned at the beginning, much misinformation is what we call kind of reconfigured content. And in fact, we found that as much as 60% was reconfigured rather than being wholly fabricated. A good example of this is of course that piece that I began with, where each of those recommendations is just a little bit off. But it also includes pieces like this that show a picture or a video and claim it's something that it's not. So here's an image that was shared very widely, claims to be showing victims of the virus being buried in mass graves. What the image doesn't show, however, is Matt Damon or Kate Winslet standing off screen. Right? This is actually a still from the movie Contagion. And notably, though, I'll say that our data do show that reconfigured content had, on the whole, sort of significantly greater engagement on social media than wholly fabricated content, suggesting that, people may find this sort of reconfigured content kind of more believable. And now, also say that, this is not only true for COVID misinformation. Often misinformation has some sort of element of truth in it, and is that sort of twisting or mislabeling of content. Now, the second thing about formats that I want to say is that we saw a small amount of manipulated content that involves videos or images that had been altered. It was a small number, it was about 6% of our sample. And recently, as I'm sure you all know, there's been a great deal of concern about deepfakes and other AI-based means of manipulating video in frankly, really scary ways. But all of the manipulated content that we saw used really simple photo and video editing techniques that have existed, as long as there have been video in photographs. What the folks at Data and Society call cheap fakes, not deep fakes. And so here's an example I'm going to share. It's a video, and just see if you can identify how it's been modified.
Scientists from the University of Queensland are confident they'll be able to develop a vaccine for the deadly coronavirus. The university has been asked by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations to develop a vaccine using UQ's recently developed rapid response technology.
Yeah, so it turns out, right, all these social distancing efforts, right, and all that vaccine business is not necessary, right? I guess bananas hold the answer to the pandemic. So the creators seem to have spliced together this Australian news segment with other assorted clips. Now, why they would do this, I frankly have no clue. But the point is that the video is indicative of the type of manipulated content that we saw, right? It's quite a bit simpler than we might have guessed. And it suggests that at least as of yet, these AI-based tools are still pretty rare. All right, so
Scientists.
A lot of the examples that I've shared have pretty stark imagery, and indeed, kind of much of the misinformation out there does include images. But more in the examples that I've already shared, we can already see several different sort of functions that visuals are serving in pieces of misinformation. Now, in another article that we published, Among other things, we identified kind of 3 different functions that images serve in pieces of misinformation. So first, we saw images used to illustrate and selectively emphasize arguments and claims. Sometimes this is in really mundane ways, right? You have a claim about cigarettes, and you have a picture of a cigarette. But this can also sort of help frame claims in certain ways. So here's another image from the Philippines, and it's part of a claim that a Chinese national was was spreading COVID. And the sort of washed out picture, it was like a mugshot, and it helps frame the sort of xenophobia, right, in which foreigners are these criminals intentionally spreading the virus. We also saw visuals, perhaps more interestingly, serving as evidence for claims, as sort of explicit proof for these sort of false claims. Now, in some cases, this will involve, misidentifying images as being something they're not, like the example from Contagion. And other times it involves manipulating content, passing it off as real. And here's a good example of this. So this rail tanker has been photoshopped to say COVID-19, to suggest that it carries, I don't know, units of COVID, I guess like a slurry or something, I don't know. And it's meant to furnish this, this direct evidence, not only of the virus being, intentionally transported across country lines, but of this larger global conspiracy. Finally, we saw visuals used to impersonate authorities. And again, in a small number of cases, visuals are used to sort of make it seem like claims are coming from authorities. So here's a counterfeit document that purports to be from the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Health in the Philippines. And this one's interesting because while it seems to share kind of reasonable information about the virus, at the end there, it actually kind of concludes by saying the exact opposite of what the Philippines government was actually recommending at that time in terms of going to the emergency room. But here, right, visuals like the logo, like the formatting, are lending this sort of credibility and legitimacy to the claims. Okay, so we know something about the types of claims made, about the formats they take, but what can we say about who's spreading it? Like, who's spreading all this? So first, and this is going to sound pretty obvious, right? But we saw evidence that misinformation about COVID is being spread both from the bottom up and from the top down, both from regular people, mostly on social media, and from prominent figures across platforms and media. And while we don't have the sort of detailed audience data that we really like about who is sharing it, there's indication that from the kind of bottom up side that COVID is not notably different from what we know about misinformation more generally. So for example, that a small number of people share much of the information out there, that partisans share more likely to share misinformation, and that older users are more often share misinformation than younger users. Now, that all being said, in our data, as I said, we saw that prominent people produced or spread 20% of the pieces of misinformation in the sample, and that's by number. And this ranges, right, from influencers, actors, tech entrepreneurs, and of course, politicians. But notably, the content shared by those prominent people actually accounted for nearly 70% of the total engagements, right, in the sample that we had data for. So that's to say, right, that these prominent people are sharing, a small percentage of the total pieces of misinformation, but they account for a very large percent of the total engagements. And of course, this isn't really surprising. And I'll just say, like, our data don't actually, this is just social media engagements. They don't include things like reach of news articles or TV coverage. And so it certainly underrepresents the true influence of some of these really, really prominent people. And of course, as the year has gone on, right, this has become very, very clear, right, how a small number of very prominent people have been responsible for sharing much of the misinformation about COVID. Of course, Trump, right, is the most prominent example here. But there are a small number of what others have called misinformation super spreaders, people in groups with these huge followings on social media that command a great deal of attention. And of course, this has really animated some of the effort around deplatforming some of these big spreaders. Now, one other notable source of misinformation that I really should mention is we've seen evidence that foreign governments are spreading misinformation about COVID, both covertly and through state-backed media channels. Now, perhaps most notably, Russia has been sort of continuing their persistent attack on legitimacy and trust by spreading just a mass of lies and fostering confusion and social division, often by trying to worsen existing social fractions, especially around race. Early on in the pandemic, they amplified all sorts of conspiracy theories that either downplayed the virus or linked it to the US or did other things. More recently, however, they've been actually attacking sort of non-Russian made vaccines, especially the Oxford AstraZeneca one, which they've referred to as like a monkey vaccine. This is an image shared by Russian outlets. China also, though, has they've been a bit more sort of targeted in what they do in terms of spreading misinformation. And often it's been sort of more lies about the origins of the virus, claims about the origins of the virus. Here's an investigation by the Global Times that claims the virus actually originated in Europe, I think in Spain, they say, not in China. Or they do a lot to sort of throw shade on how other countries have dealt with the pandemic. Now, I'll just say one analysis from the Oxford Internet Institute actually found that misinformation from state-backed channels in China, in Iran, Russia, and Turkey actually had significantly more engagements than sort of comparable, more mainstream media in those countries. So we know that this sort of content is actually getting a pretty good traction. All right, that brings us to responses. So across the year, the different platforms have approached COVID-19 misinformation in different ways. And the interventions that they've taken have really kind of evolved throughout the year. And I don't have time to chart them all, and it would be kind of a long, somewhat tedious story. But I will just say that the sort of trajectory over the year has been a sort of a ramping up of action against COVID misinformation, deranking, labeling, removing, deplatforming. Facebook has drawn a great deal of attention for how they have and have not dealt with COVID misinformation. And I do just want to take a minute to talk about what is sort of one of the cornerstones of their approach. That's the Facebook fact-checking partnership. So a few years ago, Facebook began partnering with independent fact-checking outlets around the world. Basically, these outlets are given money and access to a special dashboard, Facebook dashboard, where they can see posts and claims kind of circulating widely. And early in the pandemic, Facebook began integrating these fact checks about COVID-19 into the platform, both labeling content as false, as you can see on the right up there, but also deranking it. And I think that's really important to sort of recognize that a lot of what the platforms have been doing goes on behind the scenes, where we can't actually see it in terms of how they derank and deprioritize content in feeds or in search. Now, the real reason I bring this up is to lead into the final section. And that looks at how users have responded to the responses by platforms. And this project was very simple. It asks about the experience of being content moderated on the basis of fact checks on Facebook. And it starts with this really simple question. How does it feel to be fact checked? And so what I did is I completed a series of semi-structured interviews with people from 8 countries whose content about COVID had been specifically fact-checked by independent fact-checkers and then labeled or removed by Facebook. And I identified them by working backwards, and I'm happy to sort of talk in the Q&A about how I track these people down. But I should say it wasn't easy, and the people who I ultimately convinced to be interviewed do not in any way represent like they're no way like a representative sample. They're mostly white, male, and right-wing politically. But even more importantly, right, like, they were people who had very strong opinions about being fact-checked and actioned. That being said, like, despite not being a representative sample, it still tells us something really important about the sorts of experiences people have with content moderation. So as I said, right, for the most part, being fact-check kind of motivated an emotional response in informants, right? And here are some of the ways that people described feeling, right? It's to say that many felt provoked. And I'm just going to highlight two other quotes. One told me, it's almost like a badge of honor to get fact-checked. Right? It's a badge of honor to be fact-checked because they felt fact-checkers were part of the problem, right? They were part of the same mainstream media and institutions that they reject, right? It's a badge of honor because they are not ignored, right? They're successful enough to warrant attention, even if it's a refutation, right? The second quote, but when someone attempts to cover our mouth in attempts to silence you, that is the best time to scream. Right? It's a similar sentiment. But what they meant is that, they're encouraged after being fact-checked to share more, right? Rather than sharing less. Now, as you can see, right, most of the people I spoke with ultimately rejected the fact check, of their content. But to understand sort of, why they did, we have to look a little bit deeper. And most of the people that I interviewed sort of articulated a set of kind of folk theories or understandings or explanations about fact checking and content moderation that help to explain why they reacted how they did. And these tend to have sort of two underlying threads. First, that fact-checking is opaque, right? So for many, much about content moderation and fact-checking remains really unclear. First, like who's doing it, right? And so for example, many don't understand that Facebook and fact-checkers are different, and they often confuse the two and think that they are being fact-checked by Facebook. Right. And of course, right, it's worth pointing out, right, that Facebook's whole model of, hinges on the difference between the two, on the distance that they can have between independent fact checkers making the determination of what is true and what is false and the platform. Right. But this is a distinction that very few people seem to actually understand. But this opacity is also in terms of what they're doing and why, what Facebook is doing and why. And many of the people I spoke to had all sorts of ideas and theories about actions that Facebook was supposedly taking, shadow banning, where someone's distribution is cut off, your posts effectively disappear from feeds, Facebook jail, which is like what they call a temporary ban. And the thing is, Facebook is not very clear about these actions, when they're doing them, why they're doing them. And so people kind of come up with all sorts of guesses about what they're doing, right? But they're guesses that often assume the worst or have all sorts of other kind of like built-in stuff there. So here's another example. I think it illustrates that pretty well. So Facebook now lets page admins access this page quality feature for pages that you manage. And this was intended to offer more transparency to the whole process. So here's a screenshot of the page quality page for one of my informants. And he kind of walked me through his understanding of this. And when he did so, he kind of communicated a number of different assumptions about how this all works. So first, he described every entry in the bottom left quadrant there as a strike. And he said that after receiving a certain number of strikes, his account would be suspended. Second, he said, they've given me 2 strikes per post, which is to say that every entry there counts as a strike. Third, he believed that after Facebook rejected an appeal he made of one of his decisions, they gave him an additional strike, and that they gave him a 7-day ban, right? And you can see that in the second entry there. It says decision made. While Facebook provided no explanation to him for the ban, he believed it was in direct response to appealing the decision, right? An action he interpreted as meant to discourage him from making future appeals. Now, with the information available, it's like totally unclear, if the entry under decision made does count as a strike, or even if there are strikes, even if Facebook, that's how it works, like Facebook is counting them. But this is certainly what the interviewee thought was going on and was this kind of key part of this whole sort of account of Facebook that he offered. All right, so the second kind of key theme running through behind these folk theories has to do with content moderation, fact-check content being illegitimate. And there are kind of 3 kind of explanations that they offer for why it's illegitimate. First, that it's inconsistent, and they often interpret this inconsistency as bias, either against them personally or more often against groups with which they identify. And of course, that's most commonly is like politically biased. And in the US, UK, and Australia, for most people, they see it as an anti-conservative bias. And of course, right in the US, the right has made a great deal of Facebook's supposed anti-conservative bias. In fact, at one point during this recent hearing, Jim Jordan, representative from Ohio said, I will just cut to the chase. Big tech is out to get conservatives. That's not a suspicion. That's not a hunch. That's a fact. The second claim is that it's illegitimate because it doesn't work very well. Informants talk a lot about the sort of limitations of automated systems, either not working or being able to be manipulated by savvy users with like takedown groups. But they also talk about sort of the issues about, how are you supposed to fact check when the scientific consensus is changing, right? As we've seen, it's somewhat changed, right, over the course of the year, right? Or where that binary determination between what is true and what is false is simply too simplistic, right? Many see fact checking and content moderation as far too blunt of instruments. Finally, maybe most interestingly, many believe that this sort of content moderation on the basis of fact checks is morally wrong. And they explain this in all number of ways. Appeals to the First Amendment, to ownership, right? So one told me, I have a right to post whatever I like. It's my Facebook. And, but also, sometimes there's kind of grander, more metaphysical concerns. One told me, in this life, I think lies are needed. It really shows that you're living and people are not ignorant. It makes that feeling that people are not ignorant. So life, it makes it interesting. Now, given their feelings about fact-checking and content moderation, informants describe sort of a series of tactics that they use to sort of try and limit content moderation or circumvent it. And these sort of approaches generally take two forms. One, they'll modify the content that they post to avoid being fact-checked. And often they did things like say, in my opinion, or they use coded language, dog whistles, right? Otherwise trying to qualify what they said. And here's a funny example. This is a manipulated image of the Gates Foundation headquarters. It doesn't actually say Center for Global Human Population Reduction. But when the informant posted this, he wrote at the top, right, this is a simulated yet true image, right? So to him, right, it's simulated, it's fake, but it speaks to a deeper truth. What's funny is when I interviewed him, he was incensed that Facebook would take this down, or I think they labeled it, right? He didn't understand. He said, I said that it was simulated, so why are they taking action against it? The other sort of broad way that they try and avoid this is circumnavigating moderation. I think that should be circumventing. And it's doing things like posting screenshots or trying to fool, in a way to sort of try and fool image detection systems, having multiple accounts or pages. Some of the bigger groups do this so that if one is blocked, they can switch to another. Or people even talked about going through and individually blocking fact checkers, like by name, like their personal accounts. Now, I should say, I saw absolutely no evidence that any of these tactics are in any way effective, but it doesn't mean, right, that users aren't continually trying to get around the fact checking and content moderation. Now, again, like given the strong feelings that people have, right, in a sense, it's notable that people continue to use it. And in fact, everyone I talked to is still a heavy Facebook user. But many that I spoke with said that they had sort of toyed with the idea of leaving Facebook. And kind of given what's going on right now, where we see a lot of people trying out some of these new, kind of right-wing platforms in the US at least, right? Parler, Gab, BitChute, MeWe, or encrypted messaging platforms like Telegram and Telegraph and Signal. It's notable, right? Like why the people I spoke to hadn't actually made the move. Like why had they stuck around Facebook? And mainly it was like two reasons. One, they said that other platforms just don't work very well. Like they describe these other platforms having bugs, being really slow. Like we saw, last week, Gab, they had so many people join them after the 6th that it basically crashed their servers, or having like really confusing interfaces. But more importantly, many told me that they continued to be on Facebook because that's where the conversation was, right? They wanted to be where more people were. And one leader of this political group in Australia, he told me this. He said, if the left are being boosted on Facebook, if the left are allowed to say whatever they like to say, why would they ever want to leave? If we go to another group because of freedom of speech, like Gab, freedom of speech, we can say pretty well anything we want there. We're in an echo chamber. We're not really being heard by the whole community. And right? So it's like, at least for these, for some political groups, the whole point is to sort of like reach out to new people and like convert them. And so why would they want to go to a right-wing only, community. All right, so I've covered a lot of ground here, I do want to just sort of quickly mark a couple things really quick that we still don't understand, right? Some of the big sort of remaining questions. Of course, like there's a million things we don't understand about all of this, but here are just a couple key things that at least I think about. Perhaps the most notable missing piece here, right, in this presentation has been any discussion about effects of COVID misinformation. And to be frank, it's incredibly difficult to sort of assess the effect of any piece of misinformation or really any piece of communication more generally. But, it's a problem, right? Because this is what we actually care about. This is the thing that we care about. We want to know, does misinformation actually, does it actually have meaningful impact on people in the world? We still don't really understand how it spreads across smaller platforms, right? Often we have data about Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, but that's it. And we have very, very little understanding of what's going on in encrypted messaging services. You can understand why, right? Third, we don't really understand, or we have some sort of sense that social media and traditional media work to amplify each other in complicated ways, but we still need a better sort of understanding of how that happens. Similarly, we don't really understand who creates it, right? We understand who spreads it, who shares it, but it's really hard to trace back pieces of content to their origin. And finally, we might know something about who spreads it, how it spreads. We still know so little about, what or how it is meaningful to people in their actual lives. All right, but rather than end on what we don't know, I do want to just circle back around and pull out a couple of the big takeaways here from what I've talked about. This is not exhaustive in any way, and certainly not, not even of like what the little bit that I've talked about today. But I guess these are just a couple of the key things that I kind of hope you take away from this talk. First, misinformation comes from the top. Right? This has been made very, very clear recently. Two, misinformation is often reconfigured, right? Partly true, mislabeled, tweaked, twisted. Right? Misinformation is defined by its falseness, right? That being said, it is often less about information. Right? It's less about how it convinces people to change their minds and more about identity, about politics, culture, trust, and race too. Right? And finally, there is no single problem of misinformation. And there are many different problems of misinformation, even about COVID-19. There are many different reasons people share it. It is found in many different locations. Russian-backed misinformation is a different problem than belief in conspiracy theories, than information holes in the early part of the pandemic. Right? This is why I actually think that the word infodemic is a poor name. It makes it seem like there's only one problem, right? And the danger of seeing misinformation as a unitary problem is that we might imagine that there's a single solution or a single answer, but there's no silver bullet. There's no inoculation, right? There's no cure for misinformation about the coronavirus. There's no banana. Instead, we face a difficult and ever-evolving set of problems that will require us not just to limit the spread of misinformation, but to address the underlying forces that make it compelling, that make it meaningful in people's lives. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. We're super excited to sort of hear your questions and keep talking about this.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting there, but I believe you can hear me now, Scott. I am unmuted.
Yeah, I can.
All right, Scott, that was terrific. Thank you so much for that. I wish that instead of limiting you to 20 to 30 minutes, I had a day or two to listen to you talk about all the work you've done, because it's really terrific. And there are a lot of great questions, that a lot of conversation in the chat, as well as a lot of great questions that have been submitted, including the pre-submissions.
Great.
At the end there, you touched on something which I thought was really interesting, and you and I talked a little bit about this beforehand, that you weren't really going to have time to go into it in depth, but we did get a really relevant question, and it's one that I think I want to start with, which is the idea of underrepresented voices and people who are underrepresented and maybe underserved in society, and what role they play in all of this, and how can those underrepresented voices become heard throughout society?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, we need to talk a little bit about this. I don't have any easy answer for this, but why I think this is a great kind of question to start with is, I think we do really need to recognize, the role that sort of race plays in COVID misinformation, or just kind of misinformation more broadly, right? We I think should have learned this lesson very clearly in 2016 with the IRA, the Russian efforts and to produce campaign misinformation. Right, we saw how a big part of their strategy was about stoking, racial divides. And but we also see this in domestic misinformation, right, spread by political actors, right, about COVID or not, right? How much of it is about race and racial divisions, and at the same time, right, I think we need to recognize that like virus impacts different communities differently, and or the way that people have different reasons for believing in misinformation, right? Or now everyone's really talking about vaccine hesitancy with good reason, but honestly, the African Americans in this country have a very good reason to be sort of mistrustful of the medical establishment, given the last 400 years and the continuing, shocking disparity in health outcomes in this country. And so we have to sort of pay attention to the role that race plays in all of this if we want to sort of make any kind of meaningful, kind of interventions. Now, I know that was actually the question. Like, I've just set up the question. Now the question is like, what do we do about it? And unfortunately, I think a lot of the questions they're going to be asked, I'm going to say the same thing, which is like, I don't know yet. We need to work on it. But I will say that, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in the next few questions, but like any sort of interventions, I feel comfortable saying that they need to be, specific and contextual and coming from a good understanding of, why people believe what they do and like why they buy into misinformation. And so, I think, yeah. So I'll stop talking there.
Right. Yeah. It's a lead question and one that there's obviously no simple or easy answer to, but a very important one. I think the elephant in the room, the GOP elephant in the room today is that today is the last full day of the Trump administration and Biden comes in tomorrow and things presumably are going to change in lots of ways. Our colleague Misha Angris put a question in chat, which actually is representative of a lot of similar questions that we received in advance. And Misha asks, we know the deficit model doesn't work. So how would you counsel the new Office of Science and Technology Policy to undo the damage to both science and the perception of science of the last 4 years? And for people who might not know, let me just clarify. The deficit model is a concept in science communication, which essentially just says that, assuming that people's lack of understanding of science or acceptance of science is based purely on the fact that we don't tell them enough about it. And if we simply give them more information, then they'll understand it. There have been lots of studies that have shown that that's not the answer and it doesn't work that way. It's not as simple as simply giving people more information because there are all these confirmation biases and things like that. So given all of that, where does Biden go tomorrow? How does he start to undo all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I think we should back up a little bit. The data we have, again, is always like imperfect, but there's actually been some interesting study that scientists have actually fared kind of well in the pandemic, and so where I used to be, Reuters Institute, they did a series of surveys and they tracked the way that trust in like news and social platforms has just gone into the toilet. But some of the other evidence seems to be that people have really continued to trust scientists and scientific experts. And in fact, I mean, kind of more broadly, this has been a kind of persistent finding, trying to make sense of the sort of crisis in trust more generally, that scientists and scientific organizations have actually managed to hold on to a little more trust than other institutions, again, like news, which is really, really struggling in that sense. And so I don't want, I think we need to recognize that there's something good here, right? Which is that it's not we're seeing a sort of like wholesale like loss of faith in science, and I think the other side of that is as you pointed out, right, like the elephant in the room, like it's politics. Like we can't ignore that, and we can't pretend that isn't happening, and we can't pretend that like there isn't a huge difference between the different sides of the political spectrum on do they believe in science, or are they willing to trust the advice of scientists, and are they not? So that being said, what would I counsel as far as the deficit model, right? Like, so, I mean, in science communication, like, recognizing that the deficit model like isn't a particularly like great way of accomplishing anything, right? There's been a huge effort over the past 20 years to sort of come up with different ways of doing sort of engagement in different ways, and so there's a huge literature out there on better ways of connecting with audiences, or whether that's sort of bringing them into the communication process and making it sort of more actual of a conversation, or actually trying to rely on people to share their own sort of understanding and expertise. So I think that's certainly a good place to start. But I say, like, I mean, certainly the deficit model seems to sort of be hanging on like in certain corners, and people, I mean, you've seen a lot of that in the pandemic, right? It's like, well, we just need to dump out better information. I mean, Facebook's a great example of that, right? Like, for a long time, like, one of the big things that they were saying that they were doing was like, oh, we have like a coronavirus information center. It's like, okay, like what's that going to do? Like a couple of links on the homepage. Yeah, so I think I don't know. I guess I would advise them to go talk to people who are smarter than me and who have been studying this. And there's a lot of sort of great resources for ways to sort of get communities involved more actively in talking about some of these problems.
Great. I want to shift a little bit and talk about social media. There's been a lot of conversation just in the chat about Parler, and there were several questions submitted in advance having to do with the notion that social media has been one of the major sources of misinformation and disinformation. So I'd like to ask you a couple of things. One, do you believe that social media can be counteracted to actually promote good information and counteract the bad information that's out there? Or is it just a lost cause at this point? And then can you talk just a little bit about Parler and where this all fits into this?
Sure. Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah, so I'll get to Parler in a second. Yeah, no. I think so. Okay. Yes, social media has been a huge part of this. Like, there's no denying that. And yes, I will say, like, I think we do a disservice to sort of ignore like misinformation offline too. And I think I think where the sort of research is going now is looking at the ways that social media and offline media kind of complement each other and amplify each other. So I think we need to sort of recognize that it's not only that Trump is tweeting, but it's also that news is reporting on his tweets like their news constantly, right? So it's like, that being said, yes, yeah, like there can be no denying that like social media has played a huge role in this. And I think that the thing to realize is like nothing happens by chance on social media, right? Like every decision that they've made, everything that happens is a product of a choice. It's a product of an algorithm. So when Facebook serves you a piece of junk content, they're doing that for a reason. They've made a choice about what to prioritize. There's a reason that it does that, right? I mean, this has been talked about a lot, but like people, like it serves you junk content because people click on it. It's a reliable source of engagement. And I mean, YouTube had a huge problem with this, which they've, I think, sort of tried to correct, where, by just trying to sort of maximize the number of minutes people spend on, they were suggesting like crazier and crazier fringe content. But that being said, I think, I certainly don't think that like that social media is all bad and we just need to like burn it all to the ground and go back to reading our hard copies of the newspaper. Although, I mean, sure, I guess we could do that. But I think there's actually something really promising about, so to go back to the last question, right, about like what are we supposed to do, right, if the deficit model doesn't work? I mean, I think the answer is, better sort of community engagement. And I think there's a real opportunity in people listen to people they know, right? That's where there's still trust remaining. It's like, I trust people in my social network. And so there's actually a great opportunity that we can use social media to sort of like help spread positive messaging. I think, I mean, everyone is saying a lot of bad things about social media now, and that's definitely justified. But like, we can't forget that like social media does some good things too about like helping build community. And so I think there are some opportunities there. So about Parler, yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, no to say. I mean, there's a lot to say about Parler, I guess. I guess my take in just a couple minutes, because I want to leave some other time for questions. But it's fascinating to sort of see Amazon kind of flex their muscles on when AWS kicked them off. It's like I feel like AWS hadn't really been part of the conversation about like the power of tech companies here. So it's been kind of fascinating to see the infrastructure start to speak and like say, oh no, we actually have a huge amount of power in all of this. Yeah, I mean, Parler has been and is continued to be a cesspit for a lot of really problematic content. Well, I should say a lot of problematic content, and some of it that is maybe objectionable, but should be allowed. I don't know. I mean, the question of like, should an entire app be forbidden because there's a problematic content on it? I don't know. These are really difficult questions. So I'll.
Along those lines, and going back to your comment a minute ago, but maybe we should just hand out newspapers instead, as a more reliable, trusted source. I just want to editorialize and say that Andy Borowitz, who probably many of you are familiar with, who writes political satire for The New Yorker, he put out a great thing when Trump was banned from Twitter. His fake news headline that Borowitz put out was that Trump was having Donald Jr. and Eric walk around DC handing out paper printed hard copies of all of his tweets. So, I don't think we can trust paper any more than we can trust electronic media these days.
Yeah.
So,
well, and of course, like misinformation is not new, right? It's not digital. Like there's been misinformation for a long time, and exactly. So the problem. Yeah.
So I want to get to more chat questions. My friend Lenora Crabtree is here. Hello, Lenora. Nice to see you. And Lenora asks the following. Thank you for clarifying that distrust of science and denial of facts are two different things. Beyond simply recognizing this difference, can you expand more on how science communicators might approach these challenges differently?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good hard question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer to this, but I will talk a little bit more about that distinction, because I think you're absolutely smart, like you're absolutely right to sort of put that out in, and this is actually something that's really fascinated me is I think there's actually a lot of distinctions to be made here. So I'll say one of the sort of long-term projects that I've been working on for a while now is this big study of anti-5G activism in the UK. And what's always fascinated me about that is you have a group of people who rejects the scientific consensus about the harms of 5G, but they often, and I'm not talking about the radical conspiracy fringes of that, which are like all the radical conspiracy fringes, but there's this movement of people who see themselves as sort of environmental activists. It's just they're working against radiation pollution, and so in their advocacy, they use a lot of, they appeal to science, scientific research, scientific articles. A slightly more like absurd sort of example of this is the flat Earth movement, right? There's that documentary, I don't know if anyone saw it on Facebook, but on Netflix, and it was like they showed people like flat earthers trying to run scientific experiments, and then the scientific experiments show that the Earth is not flat. So anyway, there's something very bizarre about people believing in science in some abstract sense, but not believing scientists, I guess, or scientific institutions. That, of course, is something different, right? Than as we just talked about a minute ago, where like actually some scientific institutions people still begin to trust, hold on to trust. So that is a great question, and I don't have a better answer for you as far as like how a science communicator should sort of like thread that needle, like walk that tightrope about but I think what needs to sort of come is I guess the research for me is going to say like, well, we need more research to really sort of like tease out what it is that people have less trust in. I think that's the sort of best path forward, and I know that's a sort of a punting on the question, but.
Well, we are almost out of time. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and hopefully this one will be not one of these questions that there's really no good answer to, but it was a question that was submitted in advance, and it basically states that a lot of misinformation comes up in casual conversation. And what I think is meant by that is not these, public figures putting things out via Twitter or on Facebook. But going back to the way you opened this whole thing, you know, you're talking to family or friends, and they share information that's inaccurate or incorrect. And I assume mostly inadvertently and naively, but with good intentions. You know, so just sort of to wrap up, you know, for those of us who are talking to our family or our friends and hear this and want to address misconception or misinformation, you know, can you give us 2 or 3 sort of tips or pointers or strategies for ways to do it effectively?
Yeah, sure. Well, really quick, I'll just say, you know, to go back to what I said before about like there being many different problems. And so if the people you're trying to talk to are like, I hate to use this term, like radicalized, you know, they're conspiracy theorists, like I think you need to lower your expectations. So, you know, that being said, I think a general, you know, in what I've sort of seen out there and sort of good recommendations on this sort of thing are, you know, you want to approach this with empathy, you know, and this actually kind of goes back to this last project that I talked about, just sort of like, you know, as mostly a qualitative scholar, like I believe in the value in trying to understand and take seriously what people are saying, even when it goes against the mainstream consensus, not because it is true, but because it's helpful to understand the reasons that people believe things. And so I think in talking to your you know, your family, like you don't want to, you know, you don't want to sort of reject it offhand and be dismissive. No one reacts well to that, right? You have to sort of come at it with empathy and try to understand like why they believe what they believe, and make it more of a conversation where you're actually willing to sort of listen to them, right? Like, you know, I don't know about you, but like for me, if someone just starts like spouting facts at me and tells me I'm wrong, like I'm not going to believe them. Like it doesn't, you know, I mean, maybe the next day I'll like sit down and think about it, but like, so I think just trying to approach it and actually have a conversation, approaching people with empathy and being willing to sort of listen to what they're saying. That being said, right, like if they're the crazy conspiracy theorists, like I don't know, maybe just don't even try. I don't know. Yeah, that's a lot harder. So.
Well, that's great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We of course didn't get to all the questions, but I want to thank everyone for connecting and tuning in, and for all the great questions and the chat, the discussions in chat. And mostly, Scott, I want to thank you for a terrific, really informative, thought-provoking session. Really enjoyed it, and it was a great way to kick off this semester's series of SciComm Lunch and Learns. Just a reminder, if you look in chat, we've got a whole great series lined up for the semester. Next month, we'll be talking about human evolution. In March, we'll be talking about communicating scientific uncertainty in weather and the weather reports. And then we will finish the series in April with a really fun session on science and poetry. So thank you again, Scott. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you next month.
Thanks so much.